Hi, and welcome to week 2. This week we'll bridge the gap between your textbooks and put some of the events of the 2 or 3 centuries we cover into context. This period we're looking at is concurrent with the period of discovery and exploration that we looked at last week, but we're focusing on a different angle and slightly different region of the world. Still, it would be silly to assert that Europeans won't pop into our narrative at some point. It would be impossible to talk about any region in the modern period without mentioning at least a little European interference. Now, with that out of the way, let's look at some vocabulary for this week. First, we'll look at the ancestor to globalization, the Silk Road. Though this term was actually coined in the 19th century by a German historian, it's an apt description of the type of globalization that was happening in the pre-modern period of this part of history. The Silk Road is not one massive highway as it would imply, but instead a complex network of roads and sea routes that promoted trade roughly westward for goods and roughly eastwards for monies. It is this network of trade, one that stretches back to pre-Roman history in Europe, that Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta used on their respective journeys. Slavery, in the very, very broad terms, is forced compulsory involuntary labor that treats people, human beings, as objects, not unlike a donkey or a wool rug. It must be stated that slavery took many forms in many different societies over a vast period of human history. Native American tribes would take slaves for various reasons, sometimes integrating them into their own society through forced adoption or for labor-intensive tasks. This pattern is repeated in the classical Mediterranean world, in China, Africa, pretty much everywhere. We can think of slavery in a different light too. Serfdom, imprisoned labor, and indentured servitude are all things that we talked about last week and are touched upon in your text, and we can consider those a form of slavery. Some enslaved labor was lifelong, such as the serfs in Europe. They were born onto the land, they were treated basically as a fixture of the land, much like a bridge or a tree or something like that. And the lords and ladies would prevent them from traveling, they couldn't marry without permission, and even their children were tied to the land just as they were, and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren. Basically, they were treated as chattel, not unlike a sheep or a cow or a pig. However, the character of slavery begins to change in the early modern period as we look at the transatlantic slave trade. While it is true that people's bodies were not their own in any form of slavery prior to this, the level of cruelty and dehumanization, callous disregard for people, and especially the racial component that becomes part of the slave trade across the Atlantic is staggering. Numerous stories of people confined in claustrophobic, hot, diseased, malnourished conditions are punctuated with stories of rapes and even mass murder. Records describe with this clinical detachment the tossing overboard of dozens of people who were ill. Their drowning was pretty much assured as they were thrown over en masse, still chained together. Even pirates, those so-called Democrats, or proto-Democrats at least, who came upon the ships would often sell the cargo or the people more often than free them. Justification for this brutality was predicated, at least at first, on the semi-truth that some of the slaves were criminals in their homeland. It was then justified by invoking the curse of Ham from the Bible, and then finally morphed into a thin veneer of legitimacy through the pseudoscience of social Darwinism. Regardless, it is one of the darkest chapters in human history and one whose legacy, both dehumanizing and traumatizing, is still with us today, due in no small part that we have not fully recognized and faced the sins of the past with humility and remorse. We must also acknowledge the dilemma that we face in this week's class. We have a lot of territory to cover and not a lot of time in which to do it. Africa is the second largest continent behind Eurasia, that amalgamation of Europe and Asia combined, and has a varied climate, topography, cultures, languages, and peoples. Thus, we're only going to focus on two African kingdoms. Now, keep in mind there is no one big African culture, just like there's no one big European culture or North American culture. They were not, in other words, a monolith, some gigantic, unbroken, exactly the same group of people that acted exactly the way that you could predict. Similarly, in West Asia, sometimes referred to as the Middle East, although that term is fairly problematic, is also varied and non-homogeneous. Many people, empires, cultures, environments, and histories converge, making our job very difficult. So, for the sake of expediency, I will focus upon one huge, long-lasting society that will be with us to the very last week of class. The theme I'm striving for in this class as a whole is revolution, a huge shift in the way things were. Towards that goal, I want you to keep an eye out for the shifts in trade. This is really a revolution in and of itself. So remember we talked about the Columbian Exchange and how it was a game changer for Europe? Well, it's also a game changer here in and around the Mediterranean. Keep in mind that as trade shifts, who rises to the occasion, who falls by the wayside, and why that happens. Also, I want you to keep in mind that this shift in the flow of money and goods does something to the balance of power. How do the strong survive? If they do, why do they survive? If they don't, why? Who rises to take their place if that happens? For example, Italy, who we only cursorily touched upon last week, is doing pretty well in the early modern period. Trade is brisk and profitable, and there's no need to fund an exploration of new, expensive, and untested trade routes. That's why Christopher Columbus found no love in Italy and why he looked further west. Italy's city-states choices in this matter resolve the society towards a different direction. And that resonates through time because slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, trade begins to shift focus from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic and beyond. Could the Italians have foreseen this? Probably not. Trade from the Silk Road and within the Mediterranean had been profitable for literally thousands of years. The Romans thought the Mediterranean was the center of the world and named it Mare Nostrum, or RC, because in their eyes, they were the center of the world, their ocean was the center of their world, and so why look anywhere further? In fact, maps in the 15th century always had Jerusalem or occasionally Rome as the central point of the world. And why not? That's where all of the focus was. Who could have possibly seen that all of this would change and inward-looking protectionism would eventually lead to disaster? A strong component of trade through the Mediterranean was the West African kingdoms of Mali and Songhai empires. Located on the fringes of our maps, these empires were nonetheless vastly rich and powerful, able to command wealth and prestige far in excess of what we would think their geography or even dismissive Eurocentric texts would like us to believe. The Mali Empire was home to a strong land-based empire that relied upon trans-Saharan trade for its livelihood. It became Africa's richest kingdom, and indeed, Mansa Musa, pictured here on the upper right, also known as Emperor Musa, is considered one of the richest, if not the richest person in history. In the late 15th century, he undertook the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca with over 60,000 people in his royal retinue. He distributed so much gold in Cairo that the metal became worth less than silver for an entire generation after he left. Gives you pause to think about how much money is floating around in West Africa at this time. Because of the wealth and trade generated in the Trans-Saharan network, the Mali Empire was able to become kind of a center of learning as well. They funded schools and universities that became synonymous with exoticism and sought after knowledge. Timbuktu, the name of the Mali capital, still evokes a sense of the unknown and far off even today. So how did the Mali get so rich? Well, a combination of pragmatic conversion, at least in the cities, to Islam, combined with the melding of local traditional beliefs, allowed for a cohesive yet forward-looking society that promoted trade and dialogue with far-flung powers. Mali's main exports were gold and salt, Salt was used to preserve food as well as a currency in and of itself in some areas. They also traded in exotic animals like elephants and gorillas, and as I mentioned before, they did trade in slaves. Slavery was very profitable. Some of these slaves were criminals of one kind or another, but also some were excess population, children whose families could not support them anymore, women and men who were indebted or perhaps even captured during a war or a raid. Basically, common everyday people whose lives were forever upended. I want you to look at these trade routes that we have here and note that these trade routes, the majority of which head to the Mediterranean. These routes persisted even after the Mali's fall in the 15th century, and most of these routes were used to transport slaves as well as goods. Many of the slaves that were bound for Mediterranean markets would filter into various societies along the trade routes and then beyond. Some, in fact many, labored and died as slaves, absolutely, living miserable existence as miners, porters, sex slaves, or even cannon fodder in some of the armies of the regions. Others, however, became part of the wider fabric of the new lands. A great example of this is the Shakespeare play Othello, in which a former slave turned merchant is betrayed. Such success stories were not uncommon, but still rare in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially in the Ottoman Empire, where slaves could, theoretically, rise to positions of power over native-born people. The Mali Empire was considered one of the greatest in Islam, as well as in all of Africa. The city of Timbuktu that I mentioned earlier became a well-known university town that attracted the best and brightest architects, judges, philosophers, mathematicians, and astronomers. In order to accommodate these new rivals, new buildings, such as this university shown here, were constructed to hold thousands at a time in relatively cool comfort. Mali's melding of Islam with local traditions allowed for the educated elite to compete and interact with foreigners, including Ibn Battuta, who wrote about Timbuktu when he arrived at the end of his journeys. Mali also became well known for their ambitious architecture, such as the Great Mosque at Djenné. Capable of holding over 2,000 people at once, this mud brick architecture keeps the interior cool through diffusion of heat, even when the hot semi-tropical climate can reach over 100 degrees. Many interpretations of Islamic law were debated and codified within Djenné, and the Mali contributions to Islamic culture are even reflected in Scheherazade's 1001 Arabian Nights. Eventually, however, the Mali fell for reasons that are a little too complex for our time together, and so we won't go into them. The primary group responsible for toppling them, however, was the Songhai. The Songhai rose in the center-western part of the empire and were responding to shifts in trade, though, as you'll see, those shifts are still more profound than even they realize. Though gold remains a prime trading commodity, slaves begin to become more and more profitable, while salt and exotic animals and spices kind of fall in demand, partly because of New World cultivation. Trade begins to move away from the Sahara and out westward towards the Atlantic. The Songhai would last for about a century themselves before toppling and splintering into smaller West African kingdoms. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, and Dutch slave traders had been plying the western coast looking for slaves to trade for, and they usually had goods to trade with, whatever was most valuable. Many of the slaves were not dissimilar to those traded across the Sahara Desert, at least in the early years, but eventually all of that would change. Finished goods were first to be traded with the native Songhai and their successors. Cloth and rum were just as likely to net human cargo as anything else, but eventually, by the end of the 16th century, the prime trade was in weapons. Guns shift the balance of power in West Africa, allowing relatively small kingdoms or even groups, tribes, to launch relatively cheap raids into their neighbors' lands, resulting in more slaves and thus the ability to trade for more guns. Raids into rival territories became the norm over time, and when kingdoms seemed reluctant or even unable to produce captives, Europeans would themselves launch raids into those kingdoms, kidnapping whomever was at hand. And conditions worsened. Europeans, and to a lesser degree of their African allies, would construct forts with an estimated 20 million people being transported through these holds, these slave pens, and into the Atlantic. The conditions were unspeakably cruel. See these lines that are coming onto the ship? Each one of those represents a third person in the stacked like cordwood template that was used to essentially fill these slave ships. These people were chained, unable to move, unable to stand, sit, use the bathroom, or even eat. They spent weeks and sometimes up to 2 months, depending on the winds, like this. If they got sick, or if they rebelled, or if the crew was just antsy about them, they could expect to be thrown overboard. Occasionally, slaves did rebel and could take over a ship bound for the New World, but even then, they were lost at sea and could easily wind up in the wrong place. The famous slave ship Amistad is one such case. Slaves that had rebelled and taken over a Spanish slave ship were captured by the United States and put on trial for piracy. Unlike the Amistad, though, most of the mutineers were often returned to slavery. Shifting further eastward, we turn our focus instead to the Ottoman Empire, a long-lived empire located on the eastern Mediterranean that was the proverbial 800-pound gorilla of the region. Doing essentially whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted. It had the power and the wealth to back it up. The Ottomans initially gained power in the 14th century as they began gobbling up vestiges of the old Eastern Roman Empire, often referred to as the Byzantines, and slowly encircling them. Eventually, they extracted tribute from the city-state while pretty much controlling trade into and out of Constantinople. All that came to an end in 1453 when the capital finally fell to the Ottomans, a turn of fortune that I would argue has the most profound impact upon world history. As the Ottomans consolidated control on Constantinople, they now undisputedly controlled the grain trade from Russia and Europe and Egypt, while also controlling and setting the price for silks, dyes, spices, and luxuries from the east into the Mediterranean. This chokehold was what allowed the Byzantines to maintain control for nearly 1,000 years, and now it had fallen into Ottoman hands. Now that the Ottomans were in control of arguably the most lucrative trade route of the ancient, classical, and medieval world had ever known, they were an early adopter of gunpowder as well, which allowed them to project their armies and conquer more territory in Europe and West Asia. At the same time, they sponsored scientists, philosophers, scholars, and scribes to improve their understanding of everything from medicine to science. It also allowed them to meld a very cosmopolitan, diverse society into a largely well-functioning and wealthy body politic. Let's compare a couple of different empires that are about roughly the same size. The Ottoman Empire in the 15th century had about 29 million people. Muslims mostly, but also Jews and Christians and others. It was actually a pretty liberal society, though it had an equivalent population of the Holy Roman Empire. Their approach was actually pretty tolerant towards nonconformists and outsiders. Well, to a degree. Though not exactly liberal by today's standards, they were a bit ahead of the curve, allowing Christians and Jews to practice their religion somewhat freely. There were certain restrictions, absolutely, like certain clothes they couldn't wear, they couldn't ring bells on certain days, they couldn't ride certain animals, and essentially they did have to pay a tax in order to continue practicing their religion, but by and large, historically speaking, they were Jews and Christians were, and some others were left alone. Moreover, legally, every subject had a right to a fair and open trial. They had a right, nominally at least, to intermarry. Well, I should clarify. Jews and Christians could intermarry. but it was frowned upon at the very least, and sometimes even subjected the married couple to violence if a Muslim and a non-Muslim married. But I'm kind of getting off page here. In contrast, the Holy Roman Empire of the 15th century was overwhelmingly Catholic, with a very small Jewish population and no Muslim population to speak of. Jews and non-conforming Christians, such as Protestants, were often subject to summary judgments, pogroms, and the occasional crusade to clear them out. Intermarriage was expressly forbidden in codified law. And in its early days, at least, the Ottoman Empire was actually fairly opportunistic and flexible in its attitudes towards other people, especially refugees. Take, for example, the period around the Spanish Inquisition. Though we do have to state at the outset that the Spanish Inquisition was not condoned by the Catholic Church at large, especially by the Pope, who had written a strongly worded letter saying that this was not in the mission of the Catholic Church. The nominally Catholic Spanish Inquisition was tasked with rooting out all kinds of troublemakers. Politically, the Spanish crown hoped that uniting the people by religion would gloss over the old rivalries between the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. For its part, the religious fundamentalists, particularly the famous Cardinal Jimenez Torquemada, did their part in making those who had converted to Islam or Judaism to Catholicism into a kind of hidden enemy within. Though most famously targeting these minorities for torture and execution, the Inquisition also swept up critics and political enemies alike. A good example of this is the author Miguel de Cervantes, whose plays and writings were a bit too critical of the Spanish crown and the Inquisition itself. Contrast that to the Ottomans, who welcomed refugees into their lands and even sponsored them settling into places like Morocco, Egypt, and Anatolia, what would later become known as Turkey. These refugees maintained communications and even intellectual ties with European lands that they fled. Muslim and Jewish scholars such as Averroes and Maimonides were influential in the late Renaissance and helped lay the foundation for the Enlightenment. At the dawn of the 16th century, we have a strong Ottoman Empire expanding into European territories. They almost successfully took Vienna, the so-called gateway to Europe by land, in the early 16th century. They also controlled the Mediterranean militarily, extracting tribute from non-sanctioned ships. They also held the holy cities of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, so trade and pilgrimage had to come through them, a fact recognized by the Italian city-states who often went to war with each other just for the privilege of trading within the Ottoman Empire. But as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, change is afoot. Though the Ottomans control Constantinople and the ports of Egypt, trade focus for Europeans are slowly shifting westward to the Atlantic. Outsiders like Portugal, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands are more focused on the Western Hemisphere and direct trade with Asia. This, plus the influx of new luxuries, further weakens the Italian city-states who squabble for the ever-shrinking trade network of the past epoch. Moreover, the shrinking in trade, combined with some political and internal developments that, again, we're not going to get into, within the Ottoman Empire, lead to the erosion of the empire's power. Between the 15th and 18th century, we see a dramatic shift in Africa and West Asia. In Africa, where once Europeans intermarried in order to gain advantage in the slave trade, by the 18th century, West African societies are tired of the voracious and often belligerent trade in humans with the Europeans. Europeans, for their part, begin to look further down the coast and even to East Africa for new slaves to feed the expanding empires and colonies in the West. African kingdoms are increasingly refusing to trade with the Europeans, especially in human trafficking, partly because it's depleting the numbers of people that are necessary to sustain the society, but also because the Europeans have begun proselytizing within their territories. So you have missionaries, both Catholic and Protestant, beginning to spread their message within Africa. The Ottoman Empire, while not a target for slave taking, also experiences a change in European interactions. In the 15th century, Europeans paid for the privilege of trading with the Ottoman Empire, kind of like a tariff, and they also carefully observed local practices and laws in order not to offend the locals. Europeans even signed terms or contracts favorable to the Ottomans, what we call capitulations, in order to curry favor with them. But by the 18th century, especially the late 18th century, the Ottoman Empire faces new rivals. Russia, England, and France are chipping away at their territory, and even the capitulations that had once been helpful for the Ottoman Empire have been turned around and against the Ottomans, allowing the foreigners to intervene in domestic affairs, allowing merchants and visitors to ignore local laws, and even establishes European monopolies on learning, luxury goods, and mineral extraction. The French even begin planning on digging a new canal in the Suez region in defiance of the Ottoman sultans who didn't want that built. It's probably oversimplistic to say money made all of this happen, all the differences between the 15th and 18th century, but would also be foolish to ignore trade and its impact on the world. Shifts in trade make possible shifts in fortunes of nation states. This in turn fuels new rivalries that propel technological changes as well as change in attitudes towards other human beings. It's tempting and easy, if intellectually lazy, to fall into the trap of thinking that technological advancement means physical, moral, spiritual, or even evolutionary superiority after all. But new technology and new skills also offer new opportunities, and not just for the Europeans. Some African nations, such as Ethiopia, rebuff belligerent would-be colonists and slave takers, while the Ottoman Empire undergoes a profound technological, social, and cultural shift in an attempt to make up lost ground. Things are still in flux by the time we get to the end of the 18th century, especially for Africa and West Asia, so don't count them out just yet. All right, that's it for this week. Don't forget to consult Canvas and for your quiz, and check out the additional resources to fill in the gaps where I leave off.